So y'all did submit some questions and whatnot, which is great. We also threw in a few that we just get often. So we kind of just wanted to make this somewhat informal, just kind of discussion, kind of open forum, so to speak. And so a lot of them kind of fall into 4 buckets. So we'll kind of go through these categories, if you will, we'll try and go quick, but give you guys plenty of time to ask questions. So don't feel like you can't butt in or raise your hand or just holler, whatever, if we're not seeing a hand up in the air. So I would say kind of under retirement, security, and longevity, some of the main ones that we get, I'd say kind of the first one is always, you see here at the top, is how much can I spend without jeopardizing my future? You know, that's kind of one that we often say the women ask 10 times more than the men. You know, not a lot of men have uncertainty in their life, and we're all pretty certain about what's going on, right? But I think the women really want that safety and security. They really want to know, how am I doing okay? And so this is a chart some of you have probably seen. This is kind of when we do our financial planning stuff. One of the ways that we look at this is to kind of just say, everybody's so unique. They got different spending habits or whatever, different, you know, size of bucket that they've saved up. So how much can we really spend? And so we often look at it kind of more like on this left chart to kind of say, from a base case scenario, here's what your situation is. You can probably get away with, you know, retiring on 120 grand a year or whatever it is for you all. On the right is kind of something a little more fun, where we, with a lot of people, are able to kind of stress test it and say, hey, you're actually in really good shape. You've got more money saved up than you're probably ever going to spend. In which case, you know, we kind of look at that as like, how many bucket list items can we be checking off? You know, and so for a lot of people, it becomes, we often say we're twisting people's arms saying, hey, go do more. You know, you've got the capacity. And so it's kind of giving people that freedom to kind of dream a little bit and kind of see what's actually possible. Because I think a lot of people are afraid to assume they can go do a bunch of stuff. Not everybody like Deb is traveling, you know, every 3 weeks or so on a new cruise. So for a lot of people that are retiring early, we get asked about health insurance. And so especially if you're retiring before 65, you know, before Medicare kicks in, you lose that group insurance. It's like, what am I supposed to do? And so some people just jump on COBRA for a little bit, but that's pretty expensive. The healthcare.gov is an option a lot of people lean on. We do have a new service, this wasn't meant to be like a commercial, but called Move Health that we've aligned with, that does help people figure out what all the options are. So we just kind of, in all honesty, kind of pass you off to them. But if that's something anybody has questions on, they also help through Medicare age. So kind of figuring out all the options and stuff. So for people that are kind of looking at retirement early, or even kind of near those Medicare enrollments, there's a good resource there. But I think a lot of people are fearful of the stock market. I think, you know, just using the stereotype, probably some women a little more than the men. It's kind of like this big scary animal, and it's like, how much risk do I need to take, or what's really out there for me? One way that we kind of look at this when we go into retirement especially is, retirements are long. You know, they're often 30 years or more, and so that's a pretty long time horizon. So we often look at this chart. JP Morgan's put this chart out for years. This is updated through the end of last year, but for those that can't see it well, it kind of shows like stocks are in green, bonds in blue, and then a 60-40 kind of mix in gray. And what it shows is over any 1 year period on the left, what's the best case and worst case range, if you will. So you can see on a 1 year basis, it's a pretty big roller coaster you could be on. But once you go out to like 5 years, 10 years, and then a 20-year period, the risk kind of goes away, as we say. It's like the 60-40 portfolio never is even negative once you're out on a 5 year rolling period. And this goes back to 1950. So for pretty much everybody in here, your whole life, plus some that we're kind of looking at here to say the worst, and that's the worst case scenario, you still made money in a 60-40 over any 5 year, 10 year, 20 year period. So we always think some people need some money in stocks, you know, or risk assets, we'll call it, from that standpoint. I think for somebody retiring at 65 that might go 30 years in retirement, you know, kind of using the numbers we mentioned earlier, if you were planning on spending 120 grand in retirement, but then you inflate it up 2.5% a year over 30 years, you're going to spend like a little over $5 million. And so I think a lot of people kind of think of that and they're like, well, I don't have $5 million to retire then, you know, and they think they can't. But there really is the ability for even a portfolio a third that size to sustain that if you're also investing for growth and not just, you know, thinking I hit retirement, now I got to be real safe, because there is a pretty long runway there, and things do, as we've seen in the last quite a few years, cost a lot more as time goes on.
And Chad, something that he's talks about with people is once you hit 65, these numbers are incredible. So once you hit 65, the odds as a couple that you live to be 90 are just a tick under 85%. And then for women, it's a little tick over 86% likelihood that you will live to 90 if you hit age 65. So when you think of retirement at 65 and then another 30 years is 25 to 30 years is a long stretch, and your money's got to, you don't want to outlive your money.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's the thing is we often talk about the different risks. It's not just market risk, it's longevity risk. Are you going to run out of money? There's all these different inflation risks that are out there. So it really is kind of balancing them based on your preference. We always say we don't want to force somebody to get on a roller coaster at the theme park they don't want to get on, get sick to their stomach and not sleep at night. So there's also, we talk about this a lot too, like these little red dots on this chart are the kind of the intra-year decline. So during every year, what was the furthest the market fell? We basically always go into it with an assumption that it's gonna fall. It's just like, it's not like this is just goes straight up over time. It's like, you gotta go in knowing these times are coming, they always do. But in so many of those cases, and this chart goes back to 1980, the market even still finishes up for the year. I mean, last year was a great example. I think during the tariff scare in the spring, we were down 19% at one point, but still finished the year positive 16%. We definitely knew some people, luckily weren't clients, but they kind of panicked near the bottom, said, just get me out, I can't take it anymore. And it's always the worst thing to do, but you all behaved pretty well, so we're proud of you. But what age should I file Social Security is a pretty common question. I think that's one of these big decisions that you got to make in life when you do retire. Is it 62? Is it 66? Is it 70? The way the math works is every year you wait, the benefit goes up 8% every year until age 70, and then it stops going up. So the textbook says you should wait as long as you can because you'll take more money out of the system as long as you live to about 78 or 80 is usually where the calculators kind of break even to say you'll pull more money out if you wait. The caveat that we sometimes talk about is if you are a risk taker, because say you retire at 62, you're not going to start pulling Social Security till 70, you decided. Well, that's 8 years you might need to pull money out of your investments. Well, maybe your investments are growing 12% a year, 15% a year. Maybe it's a really good time period, or maybe you're just a big risk taker, So not everybody's the same. We think it's kind of one of those unique things that you kind of got to look at person by person and see how much risk you are kind of taking out there and see what makes sense. But sometimes it makes sense to wait, but sometimes it can make sense to even flip it on early. So from an estate planning standpoint, I think we get a lot of questions about what is a trust? Is this something I need, or, how does it differ from a will? I think what we usually point to are 3 different things. Did you want to talk about those?
Sure. One of the biggest things is between a trust and a will is that with the will, it is subject to probate. So people are able to see what your assets are. So where that comes into matter, you're dead, so you could care less. But it's, do you want whomever you left your assets to, now somebody picks up the paper and they're literally able to see that, oh, well, this person, this estate was this, they know who your kids are and so forth. And so that becomes more that personal safety aspect of, do you want everyone to know what assets you left? But they function the same in terms of, hey, you're designating where everything goes, but it really is that's one of the key differences is that people do have the ability to see what was in your estate if you do it just simply underneath a will.
So that probate process too is really just the process of it going through the courts. So that's why it's public. Everything that goes through the courts becomes public. So using a will, it's also can be expensive. I mean, probate's not a cheap process. So having a trust can even save you a little bit of money. There's also a little more control under a trust to kind of make sure if you've got minor children or special needs children or, kid with substance abuse or whatever it might be, you can build in a little bit more protections for them, if you will, too.
Can you just sign a will that doesn't go through probate?
Good question. You cannot. Nope. Anything that's just a will is going to go through the probate process. And then the other documents that we often talk about too are, and Elaine kind of mentioned this, but like a power of attorney. So if something happens to you before you pass away and you become incapacitated or dementia or whatever it might be, and somebody needs to still pay the bills, it's kind of more for the financial side of things, and there's a healthcare directive, which is similar, but to make healthcare decisions. So usually we think too, we're going to talk about like kids in a minute, but think that whoever that person is that you're kind of giving that stuff to, people don't always give them copies of it. It's almost like, I don't want them to know anything until they need to, but it is often smart to get those documents in their hands earlier, kind of be transparent, let them know what could happen. And I'll admit, I just found out about this, I think it was just yesterday. But if you pulled out your iPhone and go to the settings, and there's a little search at the bottom and type in legacy, you can now add a legacy contact to where if something happens to you, because just like whoever just said passwords, that is a thing now where you can put somebody on your own iPhone that if something happens to you, they now can get access to your phone. And so many of us, I think, use the password manager now and stuff like that it does. I think that's a pretty cool thing that they've put on there. So then kind of from a gifting, family legacy standpoint, kind of starting with just gifting, thinking more charitable. Two ways that we talk a lot about this these days for people to give to charity is, when they did back in late 17, the initial Trump tax cuts, and then last year kind of cemented them a little bit longer, is the standard deduction got so big that most people don't itemize anymore. And so given to charity, you're not getting any deduction. And it's not like we gave to charity to get a deduction, However, it was kind of nice to get a tax break, so everybody wants to get their tax break back. So two ways that we see that working today. If you're over 70 and a half, you can do what they call a qualified charitable distribution, or we often call them QCDs, where you just give the money directly from your IRA to a charity, and it comes out tax-free. So that's essentially like getting your deduction back. For people that aren't 70 and a half yet, there is something called a donor advised fund, which are pretty neat vehicles that essentially, it's almost like an easy way to set up what we would have thought of before, like a family foundation or your own, little charitable foundation, where you basically open up an account, name it whatever you want to. Some people like to be anonymous and come up with, we've seen some pretty clever little names to these, but, and one of the ways that we'll think about this is, let's say on a given year, maybe you give away 10 grand a year, which doesn't add up to enough to kind of become itemizable, if you will. So you're still using the standard deduction, so you're not getting that tax break. We might say, let's put 5 years at once, kind of lump sum it into the donor advised fund, take the big deduction today, and then one neat thing about the donor advised fund is it can stay invested, and as you see fit, you make donations out of it. So it's kind of looked at as a charitable donation up front, all 50 grand in my example there, that goes off on your taxes this year, but you don't have to actually send it to any end charity anytime soon. So a lot of people make these last for a very long time. You can even set up your kids on there as like successor advisors, so to speak, down the road to decide where the money goes. And one of the outfits that we use to do this, or that we've used probably for the last, 7, 8 years, they're one of the largest ones out there that do this, but part of their service is that they even make sure that it's a legit charity that you're sending the money to. Funny story, we had somebody trying to give to Tissue like this one. They were trying to give to Louisville Athletic Department, and it was coming back. They're like, this particular client's like giving us a hard time, like, hey, why is this not going through? They happen to know this athletic director, and they're being told, hey, they're saying they haven't gotten my gift yet. What's going on? Well, we dig into it, and they're like, it's not a legitimate charity, or it didn't qualify. And we're like, what do you mean it didn't qualify? And I think the University of Louisville had not checked some box on their IRS paperwork, and it was like us doing a gift through a donor advised fund that figured it out, and they had then he's giving his buddy crap, like, hey, you got to get your athletic department together. You guys aren't even set up right, but so it's kind of funny, but they do that work to make sure it's going to a real place. But and then essentially when you think about doing your taxes, you just have one paper to kind of give the CPA, rather than, you could have done 50 gifts out of that thing and it doesn't matter. None of that matters from a tax standpoint, just the contribution into it. So they're pretty slick and easy.
And they even will allow you to do real estate in there too. So not everyone does, but that's one of the reasons we use them. So
So then there's the kids. How do we teach them to be responsible with an inheritance, or even from a young age? I think with young kids, we often talk exposure and education, just trying to get them thinking about it. Our 13-year-old just started asking, he's wanting to buy some stocks and do stuff just here in the last couple of weeks. So I think the more they start young thinking about it, the better that can be. I think too, when they're older kids, transparency becomes big, like we kind of talked about earlier with the trust stuff or the POA type documents. I think a lot of people, I think we've seen a shift probably in the last couple generations where it used to be a very private thing. Nobody had a clue what mom or dad had until they were gone. And then it was like, oh my gosh, we had no idea, you know. Now I think you're starting to see kind of more current generation being a little more open to sharing that stuff and kind of getting them ready for it. And so I do think the education part is huge on that and just kind of preparing people. And because a lot of kids will end up, or adults, with a big pile of money, having never had any experience with a lot of money, and bad things happen, you know, and so it's kind of not always the best scenario. So the more I think you can prepare them for it, the better. There's lots of ways we do that, but exposure is a big part of it. I think too, putting together like a family mission statement can be kind of powerful here. You know, you kind of talk about, this is how our family, what they value, what we do, you know, this is how we operate, you know, kind of way of just kind of cementing that into a kid's head, you know,
And so
young or old.
this kind of goes back to the donor advised fund that I'm stealing this from Chad, but he's had a couple of people where he sits down, it's a family thing to where the money goes out for the donations, right? So you're exposing them to, well, hey, this is how we have a buck, and each kids have, you know, their portion, whether it's $1,000 that they can choose for different charities, but it's not making money in such an abstract thought, or you have to be at this level, or it's, you know, it's making it more realistic that this is just part of what we do as a family, and we talk about it and we figure it out together.
So Indiana does not have an estate tax. There's a few states that still do. So luckily we're not one of them, but we do have some clients in a couple of these states. But from a federal standpoint, there really isn't, up until as a couple, about $30 million in terms of a size of an estate before you have to worry about any kind of taxes. So sometimes we definitely get into this, but the vast majority of people really aren't worried about estate taxes today. So from an AI standpoint, we do think this stuff's huge. I mean, we think there's so many neat things out there today. Jay and I talk AI, it seems like half the day, every day. So
The reality is the world changes. You know, if you think back to what cars look like in the 20s, or even back to the, Chad and I talk about this, where you can still pull up articles where people were, oh my gosh, there's no way I would use a car. I can just get on my horse and feed it an apple and go, you know, like, and that was really the argument, was why on earth would I get in a car when I could ride a horse? You know, and that's the reality, is the world changed and continues to evolve. And so we try to stay on that from a forefront. But from yourselves, and I think we have a slide on that, but maybe jump, is one downside to it is your scammers. And so we would just strongly encourage, if you get a call from a grandkid that's in Mexico, but you talked to the parents the night before and they didn't mention that the grandkid was in Mexico, well, then your odds are they're probably not in Mexico. And it could be if they're in college, you know, but, you know, that all sorts of trips happen in college. But, you know, you want to be smart about things that don't make sense. You can always call back. You can call a bank back, right? So if somebody calls you from a bank, you know, you hang up and you say, oh, I'll call the bank. You call the bank back, right? So, you know, there's different things like that. Unfortunately, that's the downside with anything with technology driven. So that's the negative to it. The upside is we were just having a conversation about healthcare and what technology will be able to do in healthcare as the world advances. So there's tons of upside, and we're excited about what AI will do for us as investments.
there is some kind of tech people that are really working even towards longevity. So, I mean, there's a chance that, you know, people live an extra 10 or 20 years even at some point. You know, I think there's this big, this one guy, Peter Diamandis, that we'll listen to a lot. He's been part of some of these, but they call him, oh gosh, I'm just thinking of this off the top of my head, but prizes, what is that called? These big prizes. It was kind of like the same thing they did back when the first person flew across the Atlantic. It was part of one of these kind of prizes where somebody, you know, these rich people just put up the money and say, hey, first one to do it wins 10 grand. I think back then is what it was. But now they've done a couple of these where They're actually in the middle of it now. I think it's like a 10-year thing, and they're like right in the middle. But it's like $100 million prize if somebody can figure out how to reverse aging. And so they're actually making some pretty crazy breakthroughs. But they're like putting up big pools of money, getting a lot of billionaires to donate to these to kind of try and move the needle. And it is kind of wild, the stuff that they're starting to figure out. And so back to the longevity thing, I mean, we might be planning for more than 30 years, who knows, right? So, but the world will probably change in the next 10 years more than it has in the last 100. And that's, I don't even think, controversial, like the way we kind of see it. It's cool from an investing standpoint. We love leaning into it and looking at it and everything, but.
Do you have a question, Charlene?
I just was wondering what your take was on investing in AI.
Mm-hmm. I mean, it's a big part of where we've got almost everybody positioned, you know, because it's so obvious to
Do you
us.
invest in the companies that are using AI, or do you invest in the AI companies themselves?
That's a good question. I think it's all the above, because we are starting to see some pretty neat use cases of companies that you wouldn't think of as AI companies, but all of a sudden their margins are expanding. Their profits went up 20% last year or something, just because they were leaning on AI to, like a logistics company, for example, that all of a sudden figured out a lot better way to do business. So. Mm-hmm.
And there's a lot of companies that names you would recognize, but also a lot of infrastructure names like Caterpillar, where people are like, well, they're helping build the data centers, but they're also have construction equipment that runs fully automated, right? So the backhoes I mean, it's crazy to watch them do the type of work. As a matter of fact, Komatsu is a construction company out of Japan, and they have an underwater. I just saw this 2 days ago, I think it was, when I was stuck in Florida. It's a different story, but and so but it's going underwater and digging trenches, I mean, it's crazy. And Deere was years ago. Deere was actually ahead of Caterpillar, where they're using drones to be able to go and seed areas and certain, or spray fertilizer, and so now you're more efficient because you're just not hitting the whole farm, you're hitting specific areas, right? Or your tractors are going straight where they need to go in these different areas of farm. So there's a lot of aspects to it. And then the companies that are building the data centers, those companies get paid. Whether it's the company that moves electricity, because things we wouldn't think about, but you've got the power grid, you've got to get the electricity from the power grid to the building, and you've got to get from the building to all the stuff inside, and those companies are doing quite well themselves. So there's a lot of aspects too. So when we talk AI, it is a vast expanse. It's not just picking, Google or Microsoft type.
Bitcoin, we get this question all the time. What is it? Number one, I don't think anybody still feels like they know what Bitcoin is, which is funny, but I think it's just the nature of this high-tech stuff. But it's almost like one way that we heard it explained was, you and a bunch of buddies are trading cards or something, and every time somebody does, everybody's got to go write it down in their notebook. Like, okay, Charlene just gave this one to Jessica. Okay, she's now got this trading card. And then we all sync up our notebooks together and keep track. Well, it's kind of like that, except it's all on this one electronic system. So rather than one bank kind of keeping track of where the assets are, it's like all these computers around the globe basically at the same time able to see all the transactions. And so that's kind of what they call the blockchain. But it's like this super transparent world of technology that kind of knows in real time who's got the trading cards, what's where, what's what. All the transactions that take place are kind of out there for everybody to see. So sometimes that seems like, well, how can that be? I don't want everybody to know what I'm buying. I don't even want my husband to know what I'm shopping for today, let alone everybody in the world. But it's all kind of done encrypted, I guess, and whatnot. It's not like your name's truly on it. And then gold. A lot of questions on gold. It's been going kind of crazy as of late. Gold's been a store of value for like 5,000 years, so we don't see that stopping anytime necessarily soon. Some people call Bitcoin digital gold. I don't think it's quite that, but I think a lot of people in times of inflation especially is when you see gold do the best. So you go back and look at like a gold chart, you'll see the 70s, it went nuts when inflation was bad. More recently, it's gone kind of nuts again. Going up quite a bit when inflation really hits. People do kind of gravitate towards gold. But I think also there's the U.S. dollar has been such kind of the currency of the world for the last few decades that I think a lot of countries are kind of getting sick of that and trying to find another way than to use us as this reserve currency, as they call it. And so a lot of central banks around the world have been buying up a boatload of gold, also trying to, get away from having to deal with the U.S. and whatnot. Because that's one way you hear about it sometimes, not to get into politics, but it's like we do sanctions on countries where we say you can't do this or that. It's the way that we kind of sanction people is through the dollar. And so I think there are a lot of countries and whatnot that are kind of like, how can we get off this stuff? And so gold is kind of their baseline to kind of do some of that. But what else?
I think my question is more along for the kids. So we've gotten mixed reviews on how to leave wealth for your kids, but position it in a way that it helps them and not hurts them in the long run. So what's your opinion on that?
Yeah, I think we see a lot of people with custodial accounts, which are kind of like minor accounts. So if you really want it in their name, that's the way you kind of have to go about it. The downside to it is, and I think this can be good and bad. I think we've seen good and bad experiences with this, but in Indiana, when a kid reaches 21, that's what they call the age of majority, and it becomes their money, and so we've seen a lot of different ways that parents can kind of handle this, but to maybe try and shelter it a little bit more once that happens. But that's probably the biggest downside to it is, a lot of people think of themselves at 21 and think, what would I have done with a, big chunk of money, depending on how much money ends up in that thing. And so we've definitely seen good and bad with it. But I think it can be a really good tool for them to also learn. So I think that was what came up for us recently, was opening up one for Milo, for example, and his name. So he's got the app, he can look at it and try and, buy stuff or watch his investments or whatever. But if it's not truly in his name, there's no good way for him to do that and learn, because I'm not showing him our statements and stuff, and saying, we're not trying to open that curtain yet. But so I think it can be a good thing, but I think it also depends on like family wealth. Like I think sometimes we might say, depending on a kid, like, oh, you might not want to do that. But then at the same time, there might be significant wealth where we see where it's kind of like, hey, if we can give 19 grand a year as mom, 19 as dad to, so-and-so, and just get this money out of under the estate numbers, every year, then that makes sense too. So there's probably not a perfect answer to it, but I don't know if that answered anything or not.
And we kind of default to education.
Mm-hmm.
That's why we were saying that earlier, that the more they're involved, the more they are familiar with it, then the less. Doesn't guarantee, but it creates less. But, we can all think back. We were 25 and all of a sudden you got, hey, here's $200,000. We'd love to say we'd all make great decisions, but, we have to be realistic of who we were at those ages. And so that's why you want the education. Just surprising it on someone. Now you're really rolling the dice on how that plays out. And if you've got multiple kids, well, if you're saying, well, one didn't go around the right path, two did, and you're like, well, that's 2 out of 3, but we're not, we're not trying to get to the Hall of Fame, right? You want it to be 3 out of 3. So education is really the only thing we can think of that gives us the best chance of being successful with that. And the kids will always surprise you. The one that we've seen it from clients' standpoint, we say kids, they were older kids of, boy, one you thought that would be more responsible wasn't actually the one that was more responsible, and the one that you didn't think would be turned out to be. So there's no, to Chad's point, there's no guarantee. So you try to educate them, have them be involved so it's not a surprise when all of a sudden they, like managing your own checking account as a kid, and you learn a very hard, and in full disclosure, 2 of my daughters are here, and so they've got kids, and so their kids, so my grandkids have learned that, so wait a minute, if I have $5 and I want 8, and then I owe my mom 3, she wants her money, right? So then they got to do chores to get their money back, or my granddaughter who lent her brother money, which I still don't she was 9 years old and he's 11. And she's like, oh, yeah. I'm like, oh, so he suckered you out of your money is what it came down to. But she learned that at 9 years old, right? Don't trust your brother when he says he's going to pay you back. You know? So, but education was still where we always default to.
And that could be the 529 education, like, hey, put it towards college, or to Jay's point, like just getting them involved into it a little bit. I mean, I remember being blown away sitting in a conference room with a college daughter who came in with the parents, and she had, you know, a big trust account, and they were basically like asking her, like, how much would be good for you to get every month? You know, they're like asking her, and I'm like thinking, shoot, if my mom would have asked me that at that age, I would have, like, I don't know, $5,000 will probably do it a month, you know. And she like didn't want it. It was like, because she was thinking like, no, if I don't take it now, it'll be there later, you know. And it was like, I think an education thing. It was like she grew up kind of learning how this all works a little bit more, you know. And so I think that goes a long way, you know, not keeping it from them, but really trying to lean into, you know, hey, they're going to be in this world someday. How can we get them thinking smart? And we see kids that do a great job thinking, starting businesses and doing things that, hey, I've got this money, how can I use this wisely to catapult things forward, you know, so.
Or even when they start their first jobs, they're working at Kroger or something, right? And you have them put some of the money into a Roth IRA, right? You know, and so now they're starting to build. And then we have seen as kids see their investment buckets grow, well, now they want to be more engaged. They want to put money away because they're seeing it grow. And so, you know, that's a very easy thing. They start their first job. Heck, if it's cutting grass or something, although you probably don't report that, but somewhere where you truly have a W-2 where you're reporting and you have your kids, you have your grandkids, putting money into a Roth IRA.
There's kind of some interesting things too. This is probably a tangent, but where certain generations end up being more risk takers than others. So like the kids that were coming out of college in the early mid 2000s when the, you know, real estate crash is happening, there's no jobs anywhere, like they are not risk takers today. Like when you kind of fast forward, just going stereotyping, but whereas like the Gen Zers right now, or the whatever's after them, whatever our kids are, what do they call them? Alphas or something? I forget. Like they're often like seeing, all they know is stock market goes straight up, and like, you know, so they're like, they love the idea of like, hey, let's do this. So I think it's kind of like a good time for a young kid to get their appetite wet and kind of see saving money can really grow, because it's been good years, but you know, that can also work against you, I guess, a little bit sometimes too. But if all of a sudden everything falls apart, but they're like, I can't believe you told me to do this and now all my money's gone. But so then we teach them, hey, keep putting it in, dollar cost average, you know. There was like a number that we heard recently where somebody said, you just got to remember 3 numbers. It was 54, which was like on any given day, the market's up 54% of the time. So it's, you know, it's a pretty big coin flip, you could say. Like if you're having your daily emotions go on as the market up or down, you're probably going to, you know, seem bipolar to your family and friends, you know. But on any given year, it's like 75% of the time the market's up. And on any decade, it's like 95% of the time. So I think the more we can, when it is down, be thinking like, hey, our smart clients are the ones adding more in right now, you know, teaching the kids that. I think that goes a long way too, of, hey, the smart people are adding right now. They're buying when things are cheap, you know, not selling, panicking. So it can all be a lesson, you know. Well, thank you all for coming. We appreciate you greatly.
Thanks, everyone.